the Genoa bridge collapsed 2 years ago, and people were saying, well, the bridge, which was owned basically by the Benetton family, had like not been maintained properly, and then 43 people died, so it should be like taken off them and nationalized. And like the Conte government didn't even come close to doing that. It like basically bought a 33% public stake in it and said some of the rest would have to be resold. They haven't reversed the privatization. But then you get like La Repubblica, Tito Boeri, the like leaders of the liberal centrist parties, the center-left media, who are like, this is like Venezuela. Like, why are you like interfering in why is there like state intervention in the economy? And basically, like, part of that is like a cultural shift produced by the end of the Communist Party, but also really it's because in the European Union, like you can't, if you're in the European Union and Eurozone and have 2.5 trillion in public debt, then indeed you don't have many tools of state intervention in the economy.
Hello friends, citizens of the Repubblica di Bunga. It's Aufe Bunga Bunga. The date is Thursday, the 3rd of September, and we're happy to report that on the date of this recording, Silvio Berlusconi is still alive, although yesterday it was announced that our evil patron saint has contracted COVID, so we're wishing him all the best before we even get this show started. My name is Alex Hochuli. I'm in São Paulo, Brazil. This podcast is also Philip Cunliffe and George Hoare, who are in the UK. I'm the producer of this episode, which is on Italy. Italy, as regular listeners will know, is the country of the future, which is a bit of an ironic phrase. And there's been an added irony this year, sadly, which is that coronavirus hit Italy very strongly. It was the first country in Europe, as you will all know, to be strongly hit by the virus, which in another way, which is yet another way that Italy was the country of the future that announced what we were all about to receive. That's what we're talking about today, though actually talking a little bit more about Italian recent history with David Broder, who's the Europe editor at Jacobin magazine. He's a historian of French and Italian communism. And here today, we're going to be discussing with him his new book, First They Took Rome, How the Populist Right Conquered Italy, which is out now on Verso. David was actually on back in episode 30 on the 30th of February 2018, which was right before the election that brought Five Star and Lega to power. He's written this book, he's finished this book this year, which reflects on Lega's ascent. And although it's formally speaking about Lega's ascent, it's actually more a story of decline of Italy as a country as a whole, but also all political forces, old and new, which is something that Lega has benefited from.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just to return to that point about the country of the future, I mean, we sometimes say that Italy is an augury. I mean, it's looking, it shows us the future. So, I mean, if that is the case, then it's the rise of the populist.
Is that what augury means?
I mean, it might be. It might not be.
Phil doesn't like words that are found in books, so he's a little bit skeptical of calling it an augury.
I don't like words that are found in New Left Review, because this is a insurgent podcast.
How well he's read To Reason Against Reading. I mean, Shakespeare. Anyway,
Shakespeare.
No, I mean the thing that's really, I think, striking about David's book which is excellent. I mean, is not that point, but how the collapse of the Italian left and, Alex, as you put it, all the other older political forces really creates the scene for the rise of Lega and to a certain extent Five Star as well. So really looking forward to getting into that with David.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say it's also we've staked a lot of our claim on using Italy as a way to, I suppose, distill the politics and economics of other developed countries and even developing countries in terms of what's happening to them, political decay, economic stagnation, and also the specific kind of features of that, like the new party structures, the new political alignments, and the new social forms and kinds of the social life that comes with that. So I think we'll get a lot more of that from talking to David. So I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is obviously very on brand for us, but I mean, not just on brand in terms of us liking Italy or liking Silvio Berlusconi, but that it really condenses a lot of the features of the contemporary world in one country. And this was all brought home to me recently watching something that I think we might have discussed on this podcast before, I can't recall, but the Sky Italia show 1992 and its sequels 1993 and 1994, which show the breakdown of the old Italian First Republic and the birth of the new one. And many of those things, on the one hand, feel quite distant now. They feel kind of old hat, like, for example, television politics, the idea of politicians using television to communicate directly with voters. That feels old hat. But on the other hand, there's the germ there of something which is very current at the moment, which would be politicians using Twitter to connect directly to voters. So, you know,
do you mean quote unquote President Trump with his twittering?
Exactly. Yeah. Orange man bad. But, you know, there's another augury, I guess, where, you know, for all that people talk about Trump being a fascist or Trump being the next Hitler or whoever, or even being a Mussolini, really Trump is just another Berlusconi. So once again, the roots of the contemporary world are found right there in early 90s Italy. So anyway, without further ado, we should call up David and talk through his new book.
We should probably also mention at some point the thing about Berlusconi's health. And I should reassure viewers that he's going to be okay.
Yeah, we did do that, but maybe we should start with that anyway. Because I had thought about, we were obviously naturally being tagged by just about everyone on Twitter. I exaggerate, but because of that yesterday, we have to say.
Yeah, I mean, it would be, I don't know if it'd be good or bad for our brand if he doesn't recover. So we should bear that in mind.
He is in the dangerous group, like the group that is most susceptible to COVID. And I think I, for one, would be personally greatly saddened.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it would be sad if it were COVID. As I said, like on Twitter, it'd be the real subject of history was COVID rather than the organized working classes.
He's our icon. Big Silvio, as Ben used to say. Oh, dear.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, I think he'll be fine, but it's a problem you'll have to address one way or the other fairly soon, you'd imagine.
You'd assume that, but you never know.
I think he was going to live forever.
You can plastic surgery your way to infinite life.
Head in a vat, at least go to 95 or something.
Yeah, it's good.
Okay, so as listeners will have gathered, we're discussing this and recording this on the day after it was announced that Silvio Berlusconi has caught COVID-19, and joining us to discuss this issue and this issue alone is David Broder. Do you want to give us your prognosis on Silvio's health?
Well, I can't claim much inside information, although I used to know someone who knew him personally. But I mean, they say it's symptomless and that he's doing fine. And he's resting in Arcore, which is his house outside Milan and near Monza, where he owns the local football team. And they say he's working as usual and feeling fine. He apparently got it from his good friend Flavio Briatore, the disgraced former Formula One boss, who also presented the Italian version of The Apprentice. And everyone at his club, billionaire, got it, and Silvio did too. Briatore himself was in hospital but has pulled through. So let's hope Silvio he doesn't even need a recovery because apparently he doesn't even feel ill. But I'm sure he'll be fine.
I mean, I don't think he would ever admit ill health anyway. So yeah, we'll see where that goes. But wishing him all the best from.
Wishing Silvio all the best from Alpha Bunga Bunga.
Well, we all know he's literally going to live forever, so he'll be fine.
I'm sure that Silvio is using his downtime to listen to your back catalogue.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
We should actually maybe send him like the back catalogue as a kind of get well present, something like that. Maybe if we could find a way to make sure that it gets to him. We send him a nice shirt with his face on it. We could get him to do like a selfie with the shirt. All sorts of possibilities.
Yeah, he'd be delighted to know that he has really. well, has been the sort of leading figure of our contemporary age. So I'm
absolutely, we're immortalizing him, in fact, irrespective. So
exactly.
He should. I'm sure he'll be happy about that.
So much as we'd love to spend 2 hours with David talking about Berlusconi, that's not what we're going to do, and we're actually going to get on with the meat of this, which is discussing his wonderful new book. So you start the book with the idea that middle-class Italians have a conception of Britain as a quote-unquote normal country, which might even come as a bit of a surprise to Brits. What do Italians mean by this, and what do Italians want when they say they want to be normal? I should note that this is probably a discussion which would be familiar to most people who don't live in Northern Europe or an Anglophone country, because it's something that's repeated throughout the world, this idea of normality, or whatever it's called locally. But specifically in Italy, what does normal mean?
I think the idea of normality is basically like everything would function, everything would be reliable, everyone knows their place, there's no conflict, and I mean, like I think a good example would be the way in which like Italians like imagine British politics to be very different from how it is, because they basically imagine it to be like business-like and not adversarial, and think of that as a good thing. And Brexit has somewhat upset this, and also because John Bercow has made it into like Italian TV. But yeah, I mean, like I think it's very common for foreign writers, journalists writing about Italy to kind of describe all of its problems in terms of kind of cultural tropes and supposed kind of eternal ills, which are sort of somehow rooted in the soil or the national culture. But this is also something that's very much used by Italian like liberal elites. Basically, the idea that Italy is kind of backward and chaotic and corrupt, and it needs to sort of sort itself out by following some foreign model. I say in the book, because I'm British, people are like have this like fantastical idea of Britain as like this like country where like everyone can get a job, and it's they have ideas like, I mean, for example, like a really classic idea about Italy is the idea that Italy has every region is so different. There's massive inequality across the country, and even things like the language is like incomparable to one region to another. Which, like, of course, there are great diversities, but basically, in order to think that, you'd have to know like nothing about Britain.
Yeah.
In fact, Britain has more, like, depending on the like size of the regions you're looking at. But like, Britain has inequality like between like parliamentary constituencies is actually more than Italy. And there are very poor places in the UK, and indeed even the accents and dialects of the UK are quite diverse. But I mean, they just have a basically fantastical idea of it, and similarly of Germany. In fact, I think Italians probably see Britain a bit like Britons think of Germany, and like
a place where things work.
Yeah. So one thing I talk about in the book is this Federico Rampini, who's a journalist for La Repubblica, which is like the main centre-left daily. He produced a book in I think 1996 called Germanization, and like a very common idea of the kind of early phase of like the EU and the development of the euro is that because the Bundesbank was at the center of the European monetary system, and because the euro would basically be built around the model of like the reintegration of East Germany into Germany and the single currency of the Deutschmark and so on, the idea was basically like Europe will be a sort of mechanism to make all of Europe the same as West Germany, and that's a good thing. So constantly, although of course even the period before Italy joined the euro, it required like shock austerity to get the public finances in order, kind of massive like privatizations, just to raise cash year to year to reduce the budget deficit. This kind of medicine was always sold as we're like taking sort of nasty tasting medicine in order to get our house in order and then eventually will end up like a serious, normal, efficient country. And that has totally failed.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's definitely a pathology which is much more widely shared than in Italy, but it does seem to be something which is extremely prevalent in the discourse there. I mean, I like one thing that you note in the book was that you know, I'm quoting here, typical of the elitist craze to see all things Italian as backwards and all things Anglophone as modern. Renzi's move to eviscerate the workers' statute appeared with an English name, the Jobs Act. So I think that's quite emblematic and something that I'm personally familiar with in Brazil. And as I said, listeners elsewhere might find similarities wherever they are as well.
Yeah, I mean, the use of English is particularly annoying because it's often in appalling English, but they just think it sounds modern and cool. I mean, It's true of advertising and stuff as well.
Yeah, so just to move along, because really the book is, at least on face value, I think there's a lot more to it than this, but a historical account of the rise of the populist right and how they, in your words, conquered Italy. So although Matteo Salvini, the Lega leader, is obviously an important figure in this account, your argument is that this triumph actually, I mean, triumph such as it is actually really an unfolding process that begun 30 years earlier. It's one of political turbulence, while at the same time, what I guess you could call social quiescence. And one of the really striking examples of this political turbulence and the switching of sides and the movement of one party to a different part of the spectrum, at least one example which struck me was that of Maria Fida Moro, who is the daughter of the Christian Democrat premier who was murdered by the Red Brigades. She then defected from her father's party to the Communist Refoundation Party, which was a break-off from the Communist Party, and then ended up in the neo-fascist Italian social movement. So maybe, I for me, that just tells a bit of a story on its own. So maybe we can just start there, and if you could tell us a little bit about who she is and how that happened, and maybe what that suggests about the Italy of the past 30 years.
I mean, part of why it's interesting is that her father was himself a sort of Aldo Moro, who's a prime minister in the kind of mid 60s and again in the mid 70s. He himself organized two of the great political realignments of the so-called First Republic, like Italy, from like the World War II until the mid 90s. Because in the 60s he brought the socialists. So he was a Christian Democrat. In the 60s he brought the socialists into government for the first time, together with his Christian Democrat Party. Then in the 70s he tried to he was instrumental in the historic compromise and bringing the Communist Party into the governing majority, even though they never actually succeeded in forming a government together. But I mean, so he was killed by the Red Brigades in 78. I mean, I think his daughter was. I mean, I pick her example because it's so extreme and kind of funny, but really, I think she was a bit mad, because I don't think there's a real political logic. I mean, one thing that's kind of taking place at the moment in particular is a kind of like there's an attempt to kind of relativize the differences of the past. So it's like an attempt to like basically make it okay to have been a fascist once, by saying it's kind of like having been a communist once. So like in Terracina, which is a town south of Rome, they're naming a public square after both Giorgio Almirante, who was the leader of the neo-fascist MSI, and Enrico Berlinguer, who was the leader of the Communist Party at the same time. So it would be like Piazza Almirante Berlinguer.
So is this a bit like horseshoe theory, but kind of the geographical version? It's fine. They're the same. Everybody's tried both. You need to try both so you can reject both.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are quite a few transplants from, because there are quite a few transplants from the far left to the far right, and there always have been. But historically, that was mainly because most young intellectuals were fascists at some point. in the period of the regime, and then tons of 68ers ended up with Berlusconi or with the Lega. I think one facet of Italian public life is it's very forgiving of past indiscretions. So, like, I don't know. I mean, I think, like, if you look at, say, like the way Corbyn's early 80s kind of past was used to smear him, I find it hard to imagine that working in Italy. I think the sort of bad associations are too widespread for that to really stick.
Yeah. And I think maybe one thing, or at least one moment, which actually did really provide a big interruption between the past and our current period, and by which I mean the kind of 30 years since the end of the Cold War, was the fall of the First Republic. This is obviously something that we've discussed a couple of times on this podcast. We discussed it together back in 2018, but it might be actually worth just recapping that story a little bit, so that the discussion afterwards, focusing more on the Lega, on the populist right, also on the 5-star movement, all that stuff that we're going to cover over the next hour or so, is put into a little bit of context. And for me, at least personally, I always find that the history of early 90s Italy really fascinating, because of the themes that we discuss on this podcast. So maybe you could start there with the fall of the First Republic, the ascension of Berlusconi and Forza Italia, and so on.
So, I mean, I think that, because so part of what I emphasize in this book, as I hinted at earlier, is I generally reject any kind of reading of what's going on in Italy in terms of kind of like something about the national culture or some sort of propensity to be like chaotic. And I think often Italian politics is presented in a way that makes it kind of that just shows it as kind of mass of volatile stuff going on. But if we look at an only recent past, we see that it was in fact one of the most stable political systems in Europe, because from when Italians talk about the First Republic, that's because from 1947 until 1994, every single government had the Christian Democrats as like the biggest party in it. So while there were lots of coalitions and a lot of ministers and prime ministers circulating, really post-war Italy is just a Christian democratic state. The biggest opposition party, the Communist Party, was never in national government throughout that entire period. So while, of course, there was in particular in the late 60s and 1970s some very intense social conflict, in terms of the like party political system was actually quite stagnant and stable. But the problem with that and its fundamental weakness is like the solidity of the system was basically premised on the willingness of all of the other parties to gang up with each other to keep out the communists. While there were attempts by some in the Communist Party, particularly Enrico Berlinguer, its leader in the 1970s, to bring it into a coalition in government with the Christian Democrats, that didn't succeed precisely because of the killing of Aldo Moro, to which I alluded earlier. But if the communists...
obviously the end of anti-communism as a cohering force with the end of the Cold War ushers in a big transformation at the same time as you get this massive anti-corruption investigation. So maybe we can take us forward from there.
Yeah, absolutely, because the existence of the Communist Party basically made it impossible for there to be an exchange of power, particularly as Italy was a NATO country from 1949. So when the kind of internal solidity of the Communist Party was already in steep decline in the 80s, and when the Soviet Union dissolved, the leaders of the party basically decided to make it a social democratic party. Also, of course, in general, the disappearance of the USSR caused an enormous wave of neoliberal triumphalism and destroyed all sorts of left-wing forces everywhere. What had happened in the 80s, there was a 5-party coalition with Bettino Craxi as prime minister, who was a socialist, He was very close to Berlusconi, and it was Craxi who first allowed Berlusconi to have like national private TV networks, which hadn't existed before. And of course, that's important to Berlusconi establishing his power. But with this kind of system, the thing about it is, as a five-party coalition, is basically it was normal in the First Republic in post-war Italy for the parties of government to share out jobs, tendering, like private work for public works, basically among themselves, among their contacts, and this fed a very intense development of corruption. Also because the Socialist Party wasn't really like a mass-based Labour Party, it was more like a parliamentary faction. And basically after the communist, so while there'd been like scandals before of corruption in government, particularly in the early 70s, with the communist threat kind of out of the way, and also the idea of kind of integrating Italy into the European Union, formed in 1992, there was a offensive against corruption called Tangentopoli, which led to several thousand arrests, including more than half of the sitting members of parliament. And Craxi's party, the Socialists, were particularly heavily hit, but so too the Christian Democrats. So actually, while the Communist Party in 1991 dissolved and reformed as a Democratic Party of the Left, which is today's Democrat Party, they dropped the word left. The Christian Democrats and Socialists also dissolved under the pressure of these corruption trials.
Yeah, I mean, it's really fascinating how exactly that the end of the threat of communism, or of the Communist Party, leads all these other parties to feel like it's okay to open up the skeletons in their closets, or rather try to investigate the skeletons in each other's closet without risk of being overthrown. And yet what ends up happening is that those parties all end up crumbling, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think though also, I think an element of the story is also the kind of idea of, like, part of the story is, well, the Italian Communist Party has collapsed, but I think it's also an idea which is kind of like, in its own way, even the Christian Democrat and Socialist parties were kind of part of a quite kind of like statist political order. So I mean, even before then, the Communist Party had started to develop this kind of idea, which was like the not just the Communist Party. So it was like even before like 1991, there was a kind of rising tide of kind of like liberal and anti-statist opinion in Italy, and pressure for privatization. I mean, that started even under Craxi. And so even the initial rise of the Lega in the 1980s is actually fundamentally driven by the idea of a need to peel back the state, because often it's called like a welfare chauvinist party, but actually if you look at what it was originally saying, it's all the language of like bringing the efficiency of the market into the state.
Yeah, so that kind of neoliberal offensive was already present before, obviously, the end of the Cold War. But I mean, I guess just to move this forward, I mean, we obviously have then the story of the ascension of Berlusconi's Forza Italia, who's the biggest beneficiary of this and forms a government which is short-lived. Without spending too much time on that specifically, I think I wanted to maybe just move it forward and kind of park that, because I think we'll delve back into, for example, what Lega was doing already at that time, which is important to understand how it ends up in government 25, 30 years on, but also to just actually zoom forward and ask you what motivated you to write the book. I mean, was it just the ascension of Lega that made you think, okay, well, actually this story really needs to be told now?
I suppose actually, like, the book went through several different versions of like what it should be about. I hope it doesn't show up too much reading it.
Not at all. No.
I mean, because basically, also because I had planned to write a book before the 2018 election, about basically mainly focused on the kind of material that's in the second and third chapters, basically about the collapse of the Italian left and the replacement of like a sort of working class and social left with one focused on Europeanism. But over time, I decided to focus more on the reasons for the rise of both Five Star and the Lega. And after the March 2018 election, it became clear that the rise of the populist right is the bigger story. But as I said, I think all of these processes are interconnected. I mean, in like. Of course, the Lega were in government while I was writing most of the book, and they now are not. So one might say, well, they haven't triumphed. But I think what I try and show in the book is that the last 30 years have systematically shifted the entire political spectrum far to the right. So even in periods where it's like, when Berlusconi wasn't in government, he was still setting the political agenda. It's not as if there are periods where sort of things swing against our side and then it gets better for a bit, and because it's like every single government over the last 30 years has pursued reforms to worsen workers' rights, to pare back the welfare state, to cut overall public spending, to cut public investment. The economy is smaller now than it was more than 20 years ago. In fact, even before the coronavirus pandemic, it was smaller than 20 years ago. And the politics of like harsh national identitarianism and anti-immigration are ever more visible. So it's a continual process of it getting worse.
Yeah, no, I was about to say it comes very, very strongly in the book, and it's a striking, I think, characteristic of contemporary Italian politics. But you talked about the process there. So maybe before discussing, as I'm sure we will, Salvini and the present day Lega, could you start by giving us a bit of an overview of its origins and, how did this process start?
Mm-hmm. Well, the Lega originates mainly from the old Christian Democrat Party, which, and in particular, basically, like in 1970, Italy started to have regional governments, and these governments have a lot of control over all manner of big spending public policies. So, for example, the health system is run on a regional basis. In certain northern regions, which were relatively wealthier, this helped to drive lay the material bases for a politics of like, well, why should our region pay more in tax than it gets back or is allowed to spend for itself? And this is particularly true in the kind of end of the 70s, early 80s, when the post-war growth is pretty much exhausted. Italy had entered the European monetary system, which pegged the lira to the Deutschmark, and therefore undermined the sort of use of devaluation. In Veneto, which is an interesting region because Veneto, which is like the region of and north of Venice, there was a kind of split within the Christian Democrat Party there, which laid the basis for the Liga Veneta, which was one of the first local leagues. So basically, in a few regions, these kind of leagues emerged over the 80s, and then they formed a single party in 91. And they were led by Umberto Bossi, who was the first senator. I believe he was elected in 87. This party, is the only one that survived tangentopoli in the corruption scandals and so on of the early 90s. And basically it emerged initially, like it's very often said that it like used to be a northern separatist party, but that was only really true for a couple of years in the late 90s. It emerged originally as a party calling for northern regions to be able to keep more of their tax revenue. But then in the early 90s, with the wider collapse of the political system, it basically was able to exploit the crisis to call for a very general refoundation of the Italian state. So in the 92 election, which took place like after the first arrests in the in Tangentopoli, it's got about 8% of the vote, and then in the 94 election, it actually became the party with most MPs. Like it had about a sixth of all of the seats in Parliament.
So yes, I guess just to jump in on one point here, what's the appeal of that kind? You said there was a northern separatist few years, but more generally it was a regionalism. Why is that so appealing to, I guess, to the areas of northern Italy that you've just been talking about?
Mm-hmm. Well, basically the reason is that over the 80s, the public debt of Italy ballooned under pressure of the European monetary system. It went from I think 58% in 1980 to over 100% in 1992. So the state's debt was ballooning, public investment was falling, and the economy was flatlining. So basically, the effect of all of those things combined is to put more pressure on taxpayers. And in the regions where the Lega was originally strongest, would be like very provincial. So like the bases of the Lega's support are not places like Milan and Turin and Genoa, or really any big cities, but kind of like small towns. And like if you look at like what kind of person supports them, it's the most common is like small businessmen and the workers who work for small businessmen. Because I'll give a specific example. So I know a guy who does who works with tanners, like who work with leather, who like make steering wheels for German for like Volkswagen and stuff. Yeah. So it's like under the pressure of the currency being pegged, their exports become more expensive. At the same time, investment is falling, and so basically what that means is like they're under more and more pressure, and you get this kind of like self-exploitation of small businessmen who are like basically unable to compete, and at the same time they're paying out loads in tax, which is of course more distributed, it's kind of relatively more distributed towards the poorer southern regions. If you look at Veneto in particular, it's interesting because Veneto at the end of World War II was actually one of the poorest regions in Italy, and then already by the 70s was the single richest region. So like there in particular, I think the kind of so it's like a very very Catholic area historically, so, and very much a heartland of the Christian democracy. So this kind of idea, which would be like we are like hard-working people who've pulled ourselves up by our bootstraps. We used to be poor and now we're rich, and yet now we're still paying tons in tax, which is all going down south.
And that's a characterization which I think comes through very clearly in something that we were just talking about in the introduction before you came on the line, about the TV series of Sky Italia in 1992, 1993, and 1994, where the Lega are characterized as kind of slightly kind of crude, pugnacious, often small business owners who are really characterized as being somehow like kind of a bit, I guess crude and backward, I guess, and provincial, I suppose. Is that something?
And anti-fascist as well. That was the thing that I remember was the way in which. I don't know how accurate a portrayal it was, but it struck me because it seemed to tally with some of the stuff I read was about how Bossi, the founder of the League, how much he kind of would rant about fascist elites in Rome as part of his appeal. And I wondered if that was part of the appeal as well, encroaching. If you could tell us a bit more, David, encroaching on the kind of traditional strongholds of where that used to be that were part of the base of partisan resistance during the Second World War, during the Civil War, and how far the Lega succeeded in kind of eroding that base for the left in Italian politics.
I mean, it's certainly true that there's historically the resistance was far stronger in northern Italy than the south, and the Lega is a very kind of territorially rooted party. So it's it has party activities and branches and stuff which are very inbuilt to the local community. So it would have made no sense for them to have anything other than a strong anti-fascist position, particularly even if you think of the 80s, it's only one generation past the war. So Bossi actually received a prison sentence for saying his members should go round fascists' homes and shoot them. I mean, that said,
he got cancelled, huh?
Almost. But in the run up to the 1994 election, the Lega was allied to Berlusconi, and also the post-fascist party, which was then called Alleanza Nazionale. They were also allied to Berlusconi, but the Lega and Alleanza Nazionale didn't ally with each other. And Bossi said, over my dead body would I enter government together with fascists. But then, of course, they actually did form a government together, and in 25th of April '94, which was the demo for the kind of Liberation Day, the anniversary of the resistance, he tried to go on the anti-fascist demo in Milan and was chased away. So, I think the Lega is certainly able to both to build in what were former red areas, and also to do have a party engagement in the community, which is very rare now in Italian politics, because Forza Italia doesn't have members. It's just Berlusconi on the TV is the party. So the Lega is certainly in some way able to just to fill in for that kind of activism. I'm somewhat skeptical of the idea that the Lega is winning over a lot of former left-wing voters, because basically we have survey data which suggests that isn't really true. I think the thing that they are succeeding in doing, though, is basically the left in its historic heartlands, the fall in turnout is particularly severe. It's that the working class left doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, it was more. It was more that specifically. It was more the old territories that were heartlands of the partisan resistance had been captured by the Lega, rather than a specific kind of shift, like you say, of voters of old left-wing voters.
Yeah, sure. Because we have the regional elections next month. Well, sorry, it's this month now. So we have the regional elections are on 20th and 21st of September, and it's quite widely expected that Tuscany will fall to the Lega, which would be an enormous. It's like the Tories winning Hackney, or they did win Durham. It's like that. And it's in January there was the regional election in Emilia-Romagna, which is probably even more of a red region, and people were celebrating. This is Stalingrad has held and all of this kind of stuff, but it's in the historically most left dominated region, even before World War One, and the Democrats beat the Lega 55 to 45 on a 50% turnout or something.
Yeah.
So
I think that keys into, I suppose, the next question we wanted to put to you, which is it seems the whole kind of the whole underpinning of the argument, of the discussion, is the collapse of the Italian left, which we've already talked about. But I think I suppose I just wanted you to push you a bit to draw it out in a comparative context. Because it seems to be so that story of the collapse of the Italian left, and that it's still kind of running out its course today, like you say, in the regional elections in Emilia-Romagna, like you just said, as well as Tuscany. How is it that it went from being the strongest communist party in Europe to being to the left being weaker than even Greece or Spain, and that we haven't seen anything in Italy that's comparable to Corbynism or Syriza or Podemos like we've seen in Greece and Spain and the UK? So that seems to be kind of fairly striking. So the sheer kind of weakness of the Italian left. Could you tell us a bit about why it seems to be so weak compared to other European countries that have seen a kind of a brief resurgence of the left since the crash in 2008?
I think that it has a lot to do with the way in which the Communist Party was hollowed out from within long before its actual endpoint in 1991. Earlier I referred to the fact that in 1991, the leaders of the Italian Communist Party basically decided to recast the party as a pro-European and social democratic party, and went about doing that. But the fact that they were able to do so, and then kind of go about turning it into something actually more like the US Democrat Party, owes to like the fundamental weakness of the kind of sort of grassroots labor movement on which it was based. Like in the post-war period, the party was very determined not to only represent the interests of the most militant workers or industrial workers, but a kind of broad people, including layers of the population who like would have like no like strategic power or like ability to take strike action based on their jobs, including like small business owners and artisans and rural laborers. So it's like, while a worker at like the Fiat factory at Mirafiori would be able to like influence national politics by like shutting down a big like branch of national production, obviously that wasn't true of the general working class or popular membership of the party, and so the party basically sought to build itself as something much more like a kind of society within a society. So like kind of like the existence of the local party branch as like somewhere you'd like hang out, and like somewhere that you could get a job and this kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think the strength of the PCI was that in the period of the resistance and immediately after, it was an enormous force for like social mobility, and people who maybe wouldn't have had like a secondary education could like really like be something in the PCI, be like a party secretary or get a job in a union or get a job in a cooperative run by the party. Like PCI run consumer cooperatives had like 8 million members, so it was like a huge force. And it had an incredible presence in society. There's a thing called Festa dell'Unità, which is like a local weekend event run by a communist party, where like basically they'd lay on like entertainment, but like just like really lowbrow, like just like music, and they even had like beauty pageants and stuff like that, or like boxing, and like and then everyone would sit around drinking. And in the 70s, they were doing like 8,000 of those per year.
Wow, so
that sounds like something we should recreate. That sounds like
I think it sounds great. But basically the problem is, so through the Communist Party in the immediate post-war period, basically like people from very humble backgrounds could get a job and, as I say, really be someone through the party. But basically that system was very poor at reproducing itself. Because while in the immediate aftermath of fascism, like basically like anyone who wanted to could kind of like step in and be involved in the party and so on. Basically like in the 70s, it's like the same people are still in the same jobs, and the party, also because frankly, like the Italian Communist Party had functioned on the principle of like co-optation. It's not like they had democratic debates and then votes and then decided to do one thing or another. But I mean, very hierarchical organization.
Just to jump in, because I mean, for all the weaknesses of that system and its inability to reproduce itself, I mean, what ends up happening, and what looking back from our vantage point now, I mean, something was very much lost in that, and the decline of the communist movement and all the kind of the social networks, the social clubs and so on, that kind of stitched those societies all together. And I mean, just to zoom us forward, obviously, the period of the 90s and 2000s, you see growing commercialization, growing individualization, and it leads up to a point where, I mean, you've got the center left, which has become completely neoliberalized, as you've already described. And, Berlusconi is the main figure in politics and kind of sets this populist template. The irony then is that this populist template, at least the Berlusconi version, then comes to be displaced by Lega. And maybe we should jump forward to 2018 and to Lega's victory then. Really, it's a five-star movement's victory. That it's a kind of a complicated story. So maybe you could tell us about that and how Lega comes to be part of a coalition government and then comes to really take charge.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, in the run-up to the 2018 election, it looked like the possibilities were a grand coalition of the Democrats and Berlusconi's Forza Italia, or more likely some sort of coalition involving Five Star and the Lega. Part of the backdrop to this is throughout the 90s, 2000s, 2010s, Berlusconi had always been the dominant force within the Italian right. You always had three parties, but with Berlusconi as the kind of leader of the coalition, running most of the regional governments and so on. And as it turned out, he was destroyed for two kind of reasons in the 2010s. One of which was from 2011 till late 2013. He was in various he supported technocratic and grand coalition governments with the Democrats, Mario Monti. And then that ended when he had his fraud conviction in August 2013, which banned him from public office. And Salvini, at the same time, became leader of the Lega, which was in a very weak position because of the conviction of Umberto Bossi, its founding leader. But basically, this was a period of crisis in the Italian right, because Berlusconi had basically been pushed out of office by the EU and by the European Central Bank plus President Napolitano, and had basically sucked it up and then supported technocratic governments of the centre. The Lega was very weak, but then saw the opportunity to go national and start organising against the North and try and become the major force in the right-wing bloc. Broadly, I think you could say my book attributes quite a lot of Salvini's rise to I mean, it's often kind of said that like Salvini is successful because of his masterful manipulation of social media or like fake news, or because he gets money from Russia, all of these kind of things. But I actually think the reasons are much more prosaic and to do with the weak temporary setback for Berlusconi.
No, that's very clear, I think, in the book. It's notable how little of a protagonist Salvini actually is in the book. And I think, I mean, I by what you're saying, that's deliberate, and I think that's quite good, because it does, instead of building up this image of this populist strongman who by force of will has managed to transform Italian politics to his benefit, it's very clear that it's just the weakness and the crumbling of even relatively new forces like Forza Italia and Berlusconi that allow for Lega to really seize the initiative.
Yeah, and in fact, we're seeing two similar processes now, because as I was saying, like, Salvini made the Lega into a national and nationalist party. He apologized to Naples for having dissed it in the past and this kind of stuff, and started to, and basically off the back of the weakness of Forza Italia, he started organizing branches, getting like even former Forza Italia members, former fascists, to like be his like local candidates. There was some carpet bagging as well, because Northerners realized they could stand in the seat in the South and this kind of thing. But now we're seeing that is coming undone, because basically Salvini himself has been badly affected by both the fact that he quit the government in August last year and failed to prompt a general election. Then he didn't win the Emilia-Romagna regional election, and then his response to coronavirus has been very poor. And so the Lega, which had last year in the time of the European elections, it got 34%, and now it's polling about 25%, whereas Giorgia Meloni, who leads Fratelli d'Italia, the post-fascist party, they're on 15%. And basically it's a more or less direct transfer of 10% of the entire electorate from the Lega to Fratelli d'Italia. And I think it's not inconceivable that she could overtake him by the time of the next general election, which after all could be as far as 3 years away.
It's fascinating how, I mean, this in part, the whole book is a bit of a story of the cannibalization by new forces, cannibalizing forces which used to be new but now have become old. So, you described Lega doing that to Berlusconi's formation, then maybe even the Fratelli d'Italia come to do that to Lega. And I think we'll talk about that maybe a little bit towards the end of this. I did want to talk a little bit about Five Star. Long-time listeners will know that we've discussed this a little bit more in depth. We had Paolo Garbaldo on episode 60. So check out that if you want to know a little bit more about Five Star and the way it works. I personally find it kind of fascinating because it's possibly like the purest populist party in Western Europe. I mean, it's completely politically eclectic, ideologically diffuse. And I guess, and something that you point out, it's unified really only by its anti-politics. And I think something that is a real benefit benefit of the book, and something that you do really masterfully, is set up Lega against Five Star, against each other, and see what comes out of that, because they're both, quote unquote populist parties. And in fact, you quote someone, Marco Revelli, saying that, there are two sorts of populisms. The Five Star is the revolt of the excluded, of people from the South and of workers, whereas the Lega is maybe people who used to be middle class, people who used to be kind of incorporated in the dominant bloc, but who are no longer. But specifically with Five Star, I guess, I wanted to know, maybe you could describe a little bit about who its voters are and what its relationship to the left is, because I think it's maybe a lot of its discourse maybe is, or at least was, superficially appealing to the left.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, the Five Star movement first stood in a general election in 2013, and not having stood before, it got 25%. In 2018, it got 32%, and now it's polling like 15% and appears to be in crisis. But nonetheless, like, its initial rise was very dramatic in the period after the 2008 crisis. So I think what you allude to in terms of the different faces of populism, and also, like you asked earlier, like, well, why doesn't Italy have like a Syriza or a Podemos? Apart from the fact that Syriza is shit, but like, like,
but even then, it doesn't even have that.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, though, I mean, you could even say that there has been a certain convergence between Syriza and Five Star, because basically what they ended up as is just like the entire dimension of conflict and mobilization and standing up for workers' interests was just junked, so they just became the local enforcers of EU austerity. But yeah, I mean, like I was saying before, like, the reason why Five Star is strong, partly or was strong in the period of the economic crisis, partly has to do with like very like subjective factors and the weakness of Rifondazione Comunista and attempts to kind of revive the far left. But I think in a way, like, Five Star is a reflection of of Italian politics Italian political culture and of the demobilization of the workers' movement, because basically its support base is very heavily drawn from the kind of social groups you would expect or would have historically voted for the left.
Right. Just to jump in here, and maybe this is what you were going to say anyway, but what's the difference between sort of your typical 5-star and typical Lega voter?
So 5-star voters, broadly speaking, are a bit younger and much more working class than Lega voters. Often when we talk about the populist revolt in Brexit and Trump and Le Pen or Italy and whatever, we kind of only really hear about the kind of abandoned, the guy who lives in an old mining town who can't get a job anymore kind of thing. So some people who used to vote for the Communist Party and stuff do vote for the Lega, but very few. Basically, I have some statistics in the book, which is basically if you look at the 2013 and 2018 elections, basically about half of unemployed people and about 40% of public sector workers and slightly less private sector workers vote for the 5-star movement. And also the 5-star movement is much stronger in the South. It had, particularly in 2013, it had a very young electorate and very few old people and very few pensioners, whereas now it's kind of become a bit more homogenous. The Lega does have a section of blue-collar support, but it's kind of more the kind of workers who probably wouldn't traditionally have been associated with the labour movement. So as I say, workers who are working for very small businesses and would thus probably subjectively be kind of closer to the interests of their employers. If you work in a workshop that has 4 workers, you're not going to organize a strike.
Yeah.
And also it's more northern, even after going national. It's kind of cadres would probably be independent professionals, kind of say doctors, lawyers, that kind of stuff, but very provincial, and much worse among unemployed people, basically more bourgeois as well. I mean, it's kind of, we can talk about the forms of politics and rhetoric and fake news and all of this kind of stuff, but at root, the Lega is a party that calls for a 15% flat tax. So although of course I emphasize in my book that economic issues are kind of pushed into the background, or indeed that the state's power of decision making over them has been reduced, nonetheless, I mean, if you look at the fundamental economic program of the Lega, it's very, very right wing and neoliberal, and it's always been a party of privatization. And I mean, this probably, you could say that in the demand for northern regions to keep more of their own tax take, that could have implied some sort of benefit for the users of public services and so on there. But in general, it's strongly anti-public sector, whereas the 5-star movement adopts much more, or at least has at times adopted more of an idea of kind of efficiency and austerity for some, but in order to protect necessary public services.
Yeah.
But it's quite marginal to its overall rhetoric.
Yeah, but I mean, I think just at the level of voters, I mean, I do think it's fascinating, and I think it's very important the way that you highlight that it's not old ex-left working class leftists who then start voting suddenly for the populist right, which I wonder, if it doesn't have a more general applicability as well, because I think when we talk about the populist right in many places, it often seems to be more a radicalization of the old center right than necessarily leftists moving en masse to the far right or the populist right. On the other hand, you do point out something which is really interesting, which is that it's possible that 5-star kind of has acted as a gateway drug for Lega. So people who used to be communist voters, perhaps, or Democratic Party voters who then voted for 5-star, and then a further election on end up voting for Lega. I mean, do you think that's something like that's going on? And maybe even if I could venture, maybe there's something sort of similar that happened, for example, in the UK, where former Labour Party voters voted for UKIP or the Brexit Party and then came to eventually vote for the Conservative Party.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly true, and including in the British case, and that's kind of one of the reasons why I do say that Italy is not just like a weird outlier, but rather a concentration or an acceleration of what's happening elsewhere. Because one thing we can talk about in terms of party politics is stuff like their programs or their like mobilizing strategies or the kind of activism they involve. And certainly in Italy, like there's at that kind of level, the kind of space of political decision making has reduced a lot. But then another factor is simply the fact that if voters lose their like identity, the kind of identitarian party allegiance, then once it's been broken once, it's very hard to rebuild. I mean, I think that's a big problem for Labour, like because it's kind of like you have that kind of sentiment of like, oh yeah, like my granddad would be turning in his grave if I ever voted Tory, or you think of stuff like like the like Liverpool and actually I mean that Liverpool is a good example because the idea of it being like a rock solid Labour city is actually quite recent. Like it comes from like the 60s or 70s rather than like the 30s.
Yeah.
But now would seem very strong. But then the problem is it's like like kind of gratitude isn't hereditary, and like once you like it's kind of like if you look at the Italian Communist Party, like its electoral rise continued in the 80s, like after the decline of the kind of like sort of trade union sort of or workplace based labor movement. Like its ability to like bring people together wasn't just like to do with like the particular industries that existed at the time. Yet after that party had gone, then clearly the kind of thing that would connect people to working class politics has gone. And like if you think of like someone who's like a 5-star voter who might be say middle-aged, living with their parents, maybe never had a job, they're not going to have any kind of like unless they've basically inherited it from their parents, they're very unlikely to have inherited. So they're very unlikely to have any kind of like labor movement culture, and it's not like they can
So I mean,
so I think like once the parties were in government together, and the activists and leaders of 5-star were defending everything Salvini did, then it was natural that people would vote for the real thing rather than its pale shadow.
Yeah. And I mean, I think you've already mentioned there kind of generational splits. And I think there's no way of discussing Italy without discussing the generational question. And in fact, you dedicated a whole chapter to it, I guess. So maybe we should move on to that. Basically, it seems that on perhaps more than in other places, the generational question has more of a material basis than elsewhere, and certainly has more immediate political effects, it seems. I mean, just the sheer number, for example, of 20 to 34-year-olds who are needs, who aren't in education, training, or employment is nearly 30%, which is huge, really. And there's a whole discourse around this, which isn't to kind of boost up young people against the old people, but seems to be more the opposite. That I think you quote a minister of Democrat, centre-left, a centre-left former minister of Labour, who said that children should get out from under the feet of their parents. So maybe you could depict these dynamics for us.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is that the culture war is always used in a reactionary way, no matter who is saying it. So, like, I mean, I'm actually, although I in my book I call Italy a gerontocracy, and it's like a very observable phenomenon in which kind of like the kind of idea which is like. Sort of like old people know best, and the country used to be richer because old people worked harder, whereas young people are lazy. So that's like a very reactionary, very pervasive idea. Like the reason why Italy is poorer now than 20 years ago is nothing to do with like the way the political economy of is organized, but rather like just like young people today can't be bothered, so therefore the country is in decline. At the same time, I'm kind of somewhat wary of kind of generational politics, in the sense that it's also used in the other direction, which is like this constant claim, particularly promoted by the Renzi government in the mid 2010s, which was like, the reason why young people can't get a job is because there's too many old people who have jobs, and so the kind of posts are like blocked. So what we need to do is like create more volatility and basically make it easier to sack people from their jobs, so that young people can have them instead, even without like increasing the overall amount of employment. We have the same thing now, where the government imposed a layoffs ban during the coronavirus shutdown. So like literally when like no one was meant to be going to work. And the Employers Federation, Confindustria, say like, this is unfair on young people because, and Tito Boeri, who's like a very prominent economist who writes for Repubblica, kind of the politics of like Matteo Renzi, he wrote that the reason why youth emigration is highest now since it's been since the 50s is because the government has imposed a layoffs ban during coronavirus, even though of course the emigration is very certainly not caused by anything to do with coronavirus. It's been going on for years, and of course people literally can't leave or weren't able to for months. So you get this kind of constant use of the rhetoric of this kind of like generational divide in order to basically force people to work more and for less money. Yeah, I mean, like the Renzi government also introduced like a thing of like compulsory unpaid work for school students, like internships, doing up to 400 hours a year. And it's kind of like the part of the problem is the way in which the idea of I mean, like Italy has a very like undeveloped welfare state, and a lot of like what we think of as like the necessary functions of welfare are instead just provided through the family. So, like one of the things I mentioned in the book is that this like sky high and indeed rising amount of proportion of young people who live with their parents. So, like the majority of 30-year-olds in Italy still live with their parents. And like it's easy to say like, oh, that's because of some like Catholic thing, or the fact that Italians love their grandparents and their mum cooking them dinner. But when you look at the fact that there's 10% more people living with their parents now than there were 20 years ago, like the reason is because they can't make it out of the family. They can't afford to move out, and also of course because things like childcare and so on also aren't provided. And then you have in reaction to that, this kind of idea, which is like, well, because young people don't have, this is like in La Repubblica, in the Democrat Party, this is like the center left, this kind of idea, which is like, well, young people live with their parents, so therefore they don't kind of really need to be paid to go to work because they're having their expenses covered anyway. And so like
it's self-fulfilling,
yeah, so I believe it was Deliveroo, may have been Foodora. There was a bicycle food delivery firm. They had like a strike, and the like CEO of the company said, well, you can't really expect this to be like a real job. It should just be like pocket money if you enjoy cycling around. And so like an economist I quote in the book, Marta Fane, she's really good on this phenomenon, which is like the spread of unpaid work, and particularly the idea that young people basically, it's like kind of like you should do loads of free work in order to get yourself the like right to eventually have a paid job. Of course, this also connects with things like so basically, like if you think like because like Italian industrial exports have become less competitive, there's a sort of general trend towards job creation being in like low-skilled, part-time and precarious jobs, and the kind of reforms so-called Italy has had over the last 30 years have tended also to entrench this kind of idea of like of like being on, basically being like working, also being ready to work whenever you're needed, but not having any kind of stable income. So there's this kind of stuff like labor vouchers for just like doing a few hours work at a time. And of course, also all of that is combined with the fact, most young people have no experience of the labor movement, and the large majority of trade union members are pensioners.
I think that's really interesting how those things interlink. I mean, precaritization and specifically the kind of generational culture war, which, as you said, only tends towards conservative or reactionary ends. And I think one other way in which that applies, not so much in the generational question, but the question of emigration, is the fact that Italy is losing a lot of its citizens who emigrate abroad to find work. And one seeming consequence of that is hostility to immigration, which might seem paradoxical or understandable depending on your perspective. But I mean, it seems to be a phenomenon which is obviously applies well beyond Italy. In Hungary or Poland, for example, where there's a lot of emigration, that leads to a lot of hostility to immigration. And I think in the book you call anti-immigration sentiment a simple distraction from the need to improve the employment rate. I think what you've just described there is quite stark.
Yeah, because Italy. But the thing is in Italy, it's like you can't even begin. So what I'm about to say, I find really annoying, but myself. But it's kind of like it's really frustrating that the political debate in Italy kind of never really starts from. It's like at once the debate is obsessed with the idea of like foreign models and like if only we were like a serious and real country. And yet at the same time, there's not the most like basic understanding of the reasons why Italy is actually unusual and the kind of things that could be fairly simply improved, or like the kind of reasons why public investment is not just like somehow like a waste of money. Like an example I give in the book is that the employment of women in Italy is like far less than any other Western country, and the reason. The fundamental reason is the lack of provision of free childcare. So that means that the overall employment rate in Italy is like 62%, which is like 10% less than other big sort of Western European countries. So yeah, like the idea that the immigrants in Italy are taking the jobs is ridiculous, because frankly, like I lived in Rome for 7 years, and you would basically like never see a black person who wasn't like selling like tissues or lighters or whatever in the street. Like they're very definitely not taking jobs of other people.
Mm-hmm.
But no, I think like there's a kind of, it's almost a Thomas Piketty quote. He kind of means something a bit more complicated than I'm about to say. But like Thomas Piketty says, like basically, like if you leave the nation state in charge of nothing except its own borders, then your political debate is all going to be about immigration. So I think.
Yeah, no, it's a good quote. But maybe to kind of zoom back a little bit and think about the future prospects of Lega, perhaps particularly the way you frame it in terms of this goal of a nationwide conservative political party. Do you think this prize is within reach, or do you think they're at risk a risk of being outflanked by the post-fascists? We don't want to try and predict the future, but what do you think are the prospects after having taken Rome?
We do want to predict the future, so please predict the future.
Okay, I'll look into my crystal ball. No, I think while we can't make like predictions, and certainly like say a year ago, you said it was much more likely that Salvini is like definitely going to become prime minister than now, because he has the biggest party still, they're on like 25%. But the some of the contradictions of his leadership are kind of beginning to unravel. Like overall, the right-wing parties together have more or less exactly 50% of the vote in opinion polls, whereas the left plus Five Star plus the various liberal fragments are very divided. So like overall, the right is like hegemonic, and in the regional elections later this month, I fully expect them to win most of the regions, maybe even historic left-wing ones. I think Salvini's weaknesses are basically three. The first is that while he has tried to make an all-Italian nationalist party and extend its organization all over Italy, the fact that it still really is very northern-centric means that he has a kind of source of tension with the regional governments of Veneto and Lombardy, which are the two biggest regions that the Lega controls. And in particular, the governor of Veneto, Luca Zaia, is handled the coronavirus basically very effectively. At the start of it, Veneto was the worst hit region, and then he shut it down, or at least that's how people perceive it. So while even when the Lega were in government, the Veneto and Lombardy were still pushing for greater regional autonomy. So I think there's a certain like source of it's not exactly opposition to his own leadership, but there's certainly a tension between the national party and the regional one. The second is that the European question is very unresolved, and the Lega is struggling to articulate a coherent response to the European recovery fund and the current bailout measures.
Just on that, David, I wanted to ask you specifically. Do tell us about the Lega's response to the European Recovery Fund, but also wanted to ask you: do you think it was a mistake for Salvini to drop his opposition to the euro, in the long run, at least?
Well, I mean, I think like the problem is okay. So I assume from his electoral perspective, it doesn't make sense for him to argue for Euro exit because within the Lega's own base, there is an enormous divide on that question. Like, I think the thing is that the Eurosceptic sentiment in Italy is very soft. It's like because in the 90s, all the main parties, including the Lega, some would say in particular the Lega, were like powerfully pro-European and argued that the EU was going to like bring Italy like into the future. Even Bossi said that the North should split away because it would become like Germany, and the expectations, which were absurd in the EU, have been like entirely disappointed. But that doesn't necessarily lead to the idea that it would be good to leave. Basically, because if Italy left the euro, it would mean bankruptcy. So I think like the Salvini's tendency is to like pick fights over basically trivial issues around like the particular elements of the recovery fund, or like of course focusing mainly on migration. But like among the Lega's base, there isn't a majority for leaving the euro because basically savers would be bankrupted. It's like, it's like once you're in, it's much harder to leave. I mean, it's not like Brexit, is it? I mean,
no, absolutely. It's a tremendously more difficult thing.
And actually, in Veneto in particular, like Veneto is like Veneto probably has more economic ties to Munich than to Rome. So I mean, I think in particular there, I don't think that small businessmen, exporters and stuff want to. I think also it kind of like, I think there's a kind of certain idea which is a bit like. So it's I would actually argue that Italy should go bankrupt. I mean, I think they need to have they need the debt cancelled. Bankruptcy isn't like the end of the world, and lots of countries have been through that and survived and recovered. But it just like really doesn't fit with people's like expectations. Yeah. I mean, it sounds terrible, obviously.
No, of course.
So I mean, I think that in the current phase, Salvini will move towards a more sharply Eurosceptic position, at least like rhetorically, because he's in opposition. But I think he's on kind of difficult ground. I mean, part of the dynamic too is that Fratelli d'Italia, Meloni's party, is much less Eurosceptic. Like it's kind of aligned to the group in the EU Parliament, the European Conservatives and Reformists. So it was like the British Tories were in it, and like Law and Justice in Poland and stuff like that. But Fratelli d'Italia, and this is the other thing I was going to mention in my three reasons. Like Fratelli d'Italia is much more aligned to Trump, and much more starkly like anti-China and anti-Putin. And I think there's a good potential for as that kind of clash or like new Cold War or whatever becomes more more prominent as an organizing principle of politics. Of course, Italy itself, under the Lega five-star government, joined the Belt and Road Initiative and became the first country to do so. So I think there's a big split within the right on that front, and that Meloni's line is more consensual and puts her more in line with mainstream European conservatism.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's kind of a grim situation in that there doesn't seem to be any force which is right now able to dislodge this trajectory of continuing decadence. I mean, over the past 30 years, and I mean, you start off the book, I think, talking about how GDP figures and GDP per capita now is worse than it was in 1990, and so on. So it's this long, slow decline, which, as you say, even bankruptcy would probably be a beneficial thing in terms of shaking the current order up. So, I mean, I guess right now you don't see anything able to do that, though I guess we can wonder what the kind of world coming out of COVID will look like, and what kind of new forces that might throw up.
Yeah, I mean, frankly, I mean, there's earlier, one of your questions was like, well, why hasn't Italy had something like Corbyn? And part of the answer to that is also that the Corbyn thing, of course, was like totally unexpected, and it didn't like result from some sort of groundswell of support that had already existed in some other form. And also, after the Corbyn moment sort of ended, it's very rapidly disappeared. Like whatever influence or organization was built up is now very weak. So I think it's like I mean, I think the bases aren't there for something to emerge, because there's just like the means of action don't exist. The Labour movement is very weak, and the state is not going. I mean, I would consider the chances of Italexit to be very, very low. And there's a new party called Italexit, formed by an expelled five-star senator, Gianluca
and
Paradone.
Indeed, and a friend of the podcast, Thomas Fazzi, is also a member, a high-profile Eurosceptic writer.
Yeah, and Thomas is a good friend of mine, and we often go down the pizzeria Formula Uno. But I'll probably get cancelled for that. But yeah,
for eating pizza.
Pizzeria
eating pizza.
Formula Uno.
Yeah. We go there. So yeah, join us. No, like I think Thomas and I think their party will, I think, has good chances of imposing itself on the national political debate. And there's already some polls which have it on like 5%, and it's getting like some notice. And I think it could go somewhere. But then I think it's kind of like the same problem I said before, which is like it's very hard to imagine how the Italian state would actually go about organizing Italexit, and I don't think that there's anything like the kind of social bloc or the kind of forces who would all want that to happen. And I'm not sure. Like Paragone is a former five-star senator, but before that he was with the Lega, and like I imagine they're likely to be sort of fishing for support, maybe in some of the same kind of voters. So yeah, I mean, I think it's difficult to imagine how it happened, because also it's like after decades in which the entire political consensus is like the state can't do anything, it's too bad, Italy is too small and feeble, and so on. I think it's actually really hard to get people to make the jump from thinking the euro doesn't work to we should leave the euro and while coping with the backlash, also begin to like reorganize the principles of the economy away from one based on debt and property ownership to one based on public investment. So, I think it's great if Thomas can advance those politics, but I think it's really difficult. And I think we'll see how prominent the kind of idea of like public investment and stuff is in the party's positions. But like, I mean, if you look at if we look at like the left, or whatever, like the so-called Italian left, which is like the Democrats and Five Star movement, I mean, they are just like, that literally all they're doing is shoving further austerity down people's throats and telling them that they're getting this like great favor from the EU. And they're using Salvini as, it's like in the 90s they used Berlusconi as the scarecrow, and now it's Salvini. And they sort of organize against the right on a kind of culture war basis, but they're offering nothing in terms of like
well,
they have no, they don't even. I think it probably like like Mariana Mazzucato is an advisor to the Conte's government at the moment, and I mean, and they're doing like but it's kind of like, I'll give an example. It's like the Genoa bridge collapsed 2 years ago, and people were saying, well, the bridge, which was owned basically by the Benetton family, had like not been maintained properly, and then 43 people died, so it should be like taken off them and nationalized. And like the Conte government didn't even come close to doing that. It like basically bought a 33% public stake in it and said some of the rest would have to be resold. They haven't reversed the privatization. But then you get like La Repubblica, Tito Boeri, the like leaders of the liberal centrist parties, the center-left media, who are like, this is like Venezuela. Like, why are you like interfering why is there like state intervention in the economy? And basically like, part of that is like a cultural shift produced by the end of the Communist Party, but also really it's because in the European Union, like you can't, if you're in the European Union and Eurozone and have 2.5 trillion in public debt, then indeed you don't have many tools of state intervention in the economy.
That's actually a really good place to leave it. And I think maybe just to recap something which is in your book, which I'll restate the title. First, They Took Rome, How the Populist Right Conquered Italy. That the real villains of the piece in your book is not so much the populist right, who really just benefit from a wider breakdown, but it's really the neoliberal elite who lead Italy down this path of, as you put it, knowing the price of everything and the value of nothing. So let's leave it there. Thank you very much, David.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks for having me on. I hope I'm not too incoherent.
No.
Cool. And it's great to have you back on, and we'll have to have you back on when we see how the chips fall with all of this. I mean, I'd be curious to talk more about the European Recovery Fund at some point too, because I think it's actually quite a big story in different kind of national context, and it's an important one in Italy, particularly with respect to the Belt and Road and all that. So it's something we can hopefully have a chance to talk about again.
Yeah, that would be fantastic.